All right. Do we have Casey Griffiths' picture in front?
Yes, you do. Good job, Paul.
Oh, wow. We're learning to do this more expeditiously than in the past. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, and friends and family. It's a delight to welcome you this evening. I have a couple of preliminaries before I introduce our guest speaker. First, last week I presented and Mike Riggs found himself unable to join us in that presentation, but that was on the Hans Mill Hamlet. And finally, today, that book has gotten to Amazon Books. And so you can now acquire it at Amazon Books. And while it's been such a long, slow process, some of you, I think, have been waiting for it. And I wanted to advertise that it actually has finally gotten there after only some 18 months of from the time that we submitted it to the editors. Second, I wanted to highlight that I've asked you for several weeks to pray for Abigail Barnes, who spent 4 weeks in a coma, and the blessings of now 62,000 people on Caring Bridge, people around the world who've been joining their faith and prayers in her behalf, have paid off to the extent that she is scheduled to come home this weekend. And it is such a blessing for someone who spent a month in a coma to be coming out of it and have the chance to resume somewhat altered but basically normal life. Please continue your prayers for her, because the road to recovery will require a lot of additional connections to be made in that brain that got damaged, and her left side, her sight and hearing are well, still needing a long ways to recover. But the fact that she's been able to start writing, she's been able to speak, get up and start running around, and now she's being scheduled to come home, it is such a matter of gratification that so many people join their faith and prayers in her behalf, and a miracle has happened, because she has come from the land of the unconscious into the land of the cogent, and there's good reason for us to rejoice.
Wonderful.
Yes, and notice, please, that's with prayers from around the world, from a wide assortment of people. Don Deschler told me that he put her name in the temple. I don't know which temple, but he's LDS, and so that, and we had, I know the first Sunday that we had more than 20 congregations praying for her. I've heard prayers from Nepal and the Anglican priest minister, Pastor Valentine, from Africa, from Europe, Polynesia. We've had a wide assortment of people praying for her, and well, we have a bunch of Amish in our neighborhood, and their prayers count before God as well as those of any other rest of us. And it's just such a gratifying thing to have faith and prayer united in behalf of someone who then experiences that marvelous tradition of Christianity called resurrection. All right, this evening our guest is Casey Griffiths. He's the president of John Whitmer Historical Association, and will be hosting the gathering in Fredericksburg, Texas, and several of us will be there. I'm in hopes there'll be more of us than that just come to present, but at least I think there's 4 presentations concurrent, and so that means quite a few presenters, and so that means there should be a couple hundred of us there, I think. And I'm anticipating that I should have 30 copies of my book there to sign for people, and so that's one of the serendipities for me to be on this trip. But he's not only the president of John Whitmer Historical Association, he's a member of the BYU faculty in church history. He served a mission in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and then did his bachelor's in history at Brigham Young University, then later his master's and PhD. He has done work on 2 volumes of the Mormon Relics, which provides the background for his presentation this evening. However, the commonality of his interest in the Church in the Pacific has a particular compulsion for me, because my wife was the 5th generation since 1844, when the church was first established there. Well, anyway, we want to welcome Casey to the forum, and If you'll join me in prayer, we'll have the invocation and turn it over to him. Let us pray. Lord, whose creation all is sacred, functional, beautiful, with your signature masterfully created. We gather this evening to admire a few things we treasure, important in the brief snapshot of life that we measure. And we recognize that we misplace value in our short-sighted view and ask for an expanding view of you. Expanding enough to appreciate our worth and enough to appreciate our beautiful earth. Expanding enough to embrace eternal hope, seen as through a powerful micro or telescope. And we pray for our presenter, Brother Casey Griffiths, as we seek understanding of our religious labyrinths, seek a giving value to earth in the eternity you have created, and to us who are invited to be sacred. In the name of Jesus, the master of our lives, amen. Brother Griffiths, the floor is yours.
Casey, you need to unmute, please.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now we can. Very good.
All right. And can you see on the screen? Am I screen sharing?
Not
Not
yet.
yet.
Okay. Give me just a second to set that up. While I'm doing that, thank you for inviting me to be here. Now, can you see it on the screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Not only does my research overlap with Paul's interests in the Pacific, I wrote a little bit about Tahiti and Kiribati and a few places there, but this group overlaps with another huge research of mine, which is restoration movements. I'm part of the team here at BYU that reaches out to restoration movements and visits with them. And it's great to see people from diverse movements coming together in a kind of shared history of the restoration. So let me explain what I'm going to talk about. And some of you, like Paul, are already experts in this, but this is a little thing on material history. So material history isn't necessarily the things that people write down. It's the items that they keep, the heirlooms that they pass down, the trinkets. If you've ever had a quilt passed on from a family member or had somebody give you an old cane. I've got a cane that my grandpa used when he was on his mission in South Africa that's been passed down. That's all material history. And it has its highs and its lows. For instance, things like the Shroud of Turin are part of material history. Over in Europe, among Christians, it seems like for a long time, material history has been part of it, to where you can go to certain places and find fragments of the cross. Here's one that's in a cathedral in Spain. Here's one that's in Austria. You can even find bones or reliquaries. And back in the 19th century, Mark Twain went on a cruise to Europe and wrote about it. And this is one of the things he noted. He said, "We find a piece of the true cross in every old church we go into, and some of the nails that held it together. I would not like to be positive, but I think I've seen as much as a keg of those nails. And as for the bones of St. Denis, I feel certain we've seen enough of them that we could duplicate him if necessary." So material history is one of those things where it might not always be authentic, but the desire that we have to reach out and touch things is important. And I want to be clear, when I use the term relic, I'm not talking about anything that I think has sacred power, just something that is associated with the restoration. This isn't just a religious thing either. One of the most thrilling experiences of my life was going to Washington, D.C., and going into the display in the American History Museum where they show the Star-Spangled Banner from Fort McKinley. That was just absolutely wonderful. On one of my trips to the Pacific, I visited Kiribati. The largest island in Kiribati is Tarawa, where there was a terrible battle fought between American and Japanese forces during World War II. And it was really, really humbling to wade out into the lagoon and see a Sherman tank there. In fact, I think it's that tank that was in that photo I just showed you still in the lagoon, over 70, going on 80 years. Material history, just to give you a quick definition, Fernand Braudel said, material life is made up of people and things. The study of things, of everything mankind makes or uses, housing, clothing, luxury, whether or not money is used, what sort of money is used, tools, coinage, and its substitutes form the framework of a village or a town. And so, since the restoration on the grand scale of things is relatively young, there's still a lot of stuff around that we can touch and see and affiliate with early people of the restoration. I went and visited the Church History Museum in Salt Lake City and found this Book of Mormon to belong to Parley P. Pratt. I don't think it was the Book of Mormon that he read when he was converted, but it is a Book of Mormon that he owned and that he studied that's been passed down through the generation. Just across the street in the Church History Library, you can see a watch that John Taylor was wearing on his person when Carthage jail was attacked. And we might talk about this watch a little bit later on. But I've also been to places in Missouri where the millstone from Hans Mill is cemented into the city park in Breckenridge, Missouri. This was brought here by the folks in Breckenridge and made into a public monument. This is especially poignant because some of their ancestors were the people that attacked Hans Mill, and I know we talked about that last week. This is an item that's found in the Community of Christ Library in Independence, Missouri. This is a Masonic apron that belonged to Joseph Smith. And again, I'm going to focus in on a couple of these. I'm just giving you an overview. This is a piece of original mortar from the Kirtland Temple that you can see its texture and its colors there. This is a typewriter that a prophet from my church, Joseph Fielding Smith, used to write a lot of the books that he wrote. He was our chief theologian. He was also part of that Smith and Smith rivalry between the Utah Church and the RLDS, or Community of Christ Church. All these things broaden our understanding, open our minds, and they're being discovered all the time, though we have to be cautious to certify that they're right. A couple of years ago, me and a co-author set out to produce a book that would do for restoration history what a lot of people have done. This is a whole genre of books. It started out with the British Museum writing a book called The History of the World in 100 Objects. Today, there's a history of World War I in 100 objects, a history of America in 100 objects. We wanted to create a history of the restoration in 100 objects. So we sorted through a lot of things. For instance, this is a medical text, Experimental Inquiries into the Properties of Blood. You might note the name of the owner up on top, a man named Nathan Smith. Nathan Smith was a teacher at Dartmouth College that operated on a little boy whose leg was infected after a typhus epidemic named Joseph Smith. No relation between the two, but this is a text that belonged to the doctor. In the Church History Museum, I was surprised to find this painted mirror that contained one of the mottos used by the Utah Church back in the 19th century, the so-called Mormon Creed, which is mind your own business, saints will observe this, all others ought to. Even another thing that's important in my church, and this might be too inside, but this is a church basketball trophy. There used to be an all-church basketball tournament that was played every year, and this trophy was won by a group of young men in Salt Lake City, one of whom went on to be a member of the Quorum of the 70, a very important general authority in our church, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of examples I could cite. I was even surprised to find in my own hometown, I grew up in a little town called Delta, Utah, there was a dance hall there, and inside the dance hall, which has been fairly well preserved, this dance hall goes back to the 30s, and there's a giant mirror ball in the dance hall. And you might notice if you look right at the top of the mirror ball, what's affixed there, that's the Salt Lake Temple. In fact, when you walk into this dance hall, there's the angel Moroni on both sides kind of welcoming you in. I arranged to go into the dance hall itself, and this is what it looks like today. This photograph was taken about 2 years ago. You can still see the Salt Lake Temple. Here's a little bit better angle, just so you can see how they mixed social and spiritual together. But in all our traditions, there's a number of things. This is the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which was kept by the Whitmer family, passed on to Community of Christ, and then passed on to the Utah Church back in 2017. Many of you might be familiar with the stir caused a couple of months ago. In fact, I think it's been about a year, by the discovery of a photo of Joseph Smith and all the work that's been done to try and certify if this photo is real, if it's authentic, kind of the detective work that was done by some good people like Locke Mackay, and others to certify that this is the real deal. And so, in knowing I was talking to kind of a diverse audience, but the general theme was the Book of Mormon, I thought I might look at a few objects, starting with a couple links to the Book of Mormon that we researched for the book, and then expand outward and focus on things that are part of our common history. So this is one of the first objects we'd cite. This is a seer stone. This is in possession of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's in the Church History Library in Salt Lake City, and we believe this is one of the instruments that Joseph Smith used when he translated the Book of Mormon. Now, this has been in church possession since about 1853 or so. And I guess the major question is, have we fired this thing up to see what it can do? Are we ready to see if there's another round of translation ready to go? Just a few things about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon that I'll note here. Book of Mormon translation takes place starting in 1827. The book's finally completed in June of 1829, and that's because there's starts and fits along the way. Joseph receives the plates in September of 1829 and takes it home to his family's house in Palmyra, but there is so much opposition, so many people trying to steal the plates, that by December of 1827, he moves down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and there commences translation again. First phase of translation takes place from about January to about June of 1828. We think that Emma was the first scribe during this time, though she also mentions her brother Reuben Hale. At some point, Martin Harris takes over, and it's in June, when they have to stop because Emma's going to give birth to their first child, that they pause, and the infamous episode with the lost manuscript takes place. This takes place in June. That's when Martin loses the manuscript, or it's stolen. And then there's almost no translation that happens until the following April. Joseph Smith suffers a crisis of confidence. He doesn't translate. He's in search of a scribe. And then Oliver Cowdery shows up, and the entire Book of Mormon, as we're aware of it, is translated from April to June of 1829, roughly 3 months, to produce this incredibly complex book. Well, in understanding how that came forth and how that might relate to the seer stone, there's a couple things that we might clarify. Number one, these are some artistic images meant to depict the translation of the Book of Mormon. And this is a fairly knowledgeable audience. You might note that there's no screen between Joseph and Oliver, at least in this depiction right here. That's partially because Oliver said he saw the plates and saw the interpreters. And a couple sections of the Doctrine and Covenants indicate that Oliver had a go at translation as well. So we changed our artwork in part to show that Oliver might not have had a screen that was there. He doesn't mention it. This shows Joseph translating, but the image that we have here may or may not be an accurate view of what it looked like to translate. If we go back and we try to put together what happened when it came to Book of Mormon translation, the two people we most want to talk to are Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. And Joseph Smith probably makes his most detailed statement in the 1840s. He writes the letter to John Wentworth. This is a letter he writes to James Arlington. He says, "By the power of God, I translated the Book of Mormon from hieroglyphics, the knowledge of which was lost to the world, in which wonderful event I stood alone, an unlearned youth, to combat the worldly wisdom and multiplied ignorance of 18 centuries with new revelation, which if they would receive the everlasting gospel, would open the eyes of the world, make the plain old paths wherein, if a man walk in all the ordinance of God blameless, he shall inherit eternal life." Now you notice, he does mention he translated it from hieroglyphics. He says that he did it by the power of God, but doesn't mention a lot of specific details. In his 1842 history, he does mention the Urim and Thummim, and he refers to them by a description that's in the book, 2 smooth stones in silver-rimmed bows. Oliver Cowdery tends to do that too. This is from a journal entry that Reuben Miller made after Oliver Cowdery came back and rejoined the church in 1846, Oliver Cowdery stood up and said, "I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith, as he translated it by the gift and power of God by means of the Urim and Thummim, or as it called by that book, holy interpreters. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters. That book is true. Sidney Rigdon did not write it. Mr. Solomon Spaulding did not write it. I wrote it myself as it fell from the lips of the prophet." Now, if both Joseph and Oliver are talking about Nephite interpreters, then where does the seer stone fit into the picture? We've been aware of the seer stone. In fact, histories in the Utah church going back to the 19th century mentioned the seer stone. And this seer stone in particular has a provenance that goes back to Joseph Smith. Apparently, after Joseph was done translating, he gave this particular stone to Oliver Cowdery, and Oliver Cowdery hung on to it until his death in 1850, when he passed it on to his wife, Elizabeth Whitmer, before he died. Elizabeth Whitmer Cowdery. Elizabeth Whitmer gave the stone to her brother-in-law, who was from Utah, whose name was Phineas Young, and he's the brother of Brigham Young. So we've got a very short provenance for this stone. It's been in church possession since 1853, and it matches the description of instruments that that Emma Smith, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer all described. So it doesn't match what Joseph and Oliver said, but it does match what David and Emma and Martin said. And putting those descriptions together, this is what B.H. Roberts wrote in a church history. He says, "The seer stone referred to here was a chocolate-colored, somewhat egg-shaped stone which the prophet found while digging a well in company with his brother Hiram. It possessed the qualities of Urim and Thummim, since by means of it, as described above, as well as means by the interpreters found in the Nephite record, Joseph was able to translate the characters engraven on the plates." And so this is something that feels strange to us in our modern context, but as historians, we got to ask ourselves, was this strange for Joseph Smith? Was seer stones something that was out of the realm for him? A couple of colleagues of mine, Mike McKay and Nick Frederick, went back and reviewed a lot of documents from the Palmyra period, contemporary to Joseph Smith, and they found out that about 11 people in Palmyra at least had some kind of seer stone that they used for various reasons. Sometimes things as mundane as finding a water source, sometimes things as fantastic as finding buried treasure. But it does seem like it was part of the scene that Joseph Smith found himself part of. And it does seem like it was important, at least in that historical context, the people that knew Joseph Smith. You might remember the Whitmer family starts to believe revelations that are given through a seer stone to their brother-in-law, Hiram Page. And later on, when David Whitmer writes his big address to all believers in Christ, one of the things he mentions was that a seer stone or an instrument was important to him, that he didn't believe Joseph Smith when Joseph stopped using this. In fact, in the same document, David describes Book of Mormon translation. This is what he says. He says, "Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat, put his face around the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English." So an artist friend of mine here at BYU, Anthony Sweat, wanted to depict what David Whitmer described. He did a painting that looked like this. So instead of Joseph looking at the plates and kind of tracing the characters with his fingers, he depicted what David Whitmer described, which was Joseph Smith looking at the seer stone and receiving the text there. David Whitmer goes on to describe this by saying, "Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, Joseph would, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear." Now, a lot of people like this because it favors a tight translation process, that Joseph Smith was given the precise words that he was supposed to dictate to Oliver Cowdery. That means the text of the Book of Mormon has a high level of integrity. Other people have said this doesn't match some descriptions, particularly those in the Doctrine and Covenants, where Oliver Cowdery is told you have to do it by study, you have to study it out and then ask if it be correct, which seems to be more than just a mechanical process of dictation. Other people, like Emma Smith, go out of their way to say that Joseph used this seer stone during the translation process, but she seems to sort of support a tight translation too. You probably are aware that Emma said Joseph would leave and come back after hours and pick up dictation right where he left off without having to have any of the manuscript read back to him. And some of the material objects we have associated with translation, like this is a page from the original manuscript. This is on display in Salt Lake City, but this is a page from the manuscript of 1 Nephi 4. Most of the manuscript, unfortunately, was destroyed because Joseph placed the original manuscript in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house. And about 30 years later, when Emma Smith's second husband, Louis Bideman, opened it up, he found the water had crept in and destroyed a lot of the manuscript. And most of the manuscript looks like this. This is from a private collector in Provo who let me see a piece of the manuscript that he had. About 28% of the original manuscript is in existence. It was published last year by the Joseph Smith Papers Project, but the most complete, earliest copy we have of the Book of Mormon is the printer's manuscript, which has gone back and forth with different restoration movements. Some of you have probably seen this. This is in the Community of Christ library. This is the characters document. And even this kind of illustrates how complex provenance can be. The first time I visited the Community of Christ archive, they brought this out and they said, this is the document that Martin Harris took to the scholars. He visits a scholar in Albany and then Samuel Brown in New York. And then he visits Charles Anthony, and Charles Anthony's the one that gets the attention. But other people looked at this and noted right up at the top where you see where it says characters and it's spelled wrong, that's the handwriting of John Whitmer. So this probably isn't what Martin took, because John Whitmer doesn't come into the story until the summer after Martin Harris is a major scribe for the Book of Mormon. But John Whitmer was one of the 8 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, was probably allowed to copy the characters off the plate and create this document. So we think these are authentic characters from the plates. Like I mentioned, a lot of the witnesses related something miraculous happening. Emma Smith said, when acting as a scribe, he would dictate to me hour after hour. When returning after meals or after interruptions, Joseph would at once begin where he'd left off without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. She goes on to say, this was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this. For someone so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible. And I should note that the original copy, the notes from this interview where Emma Smith says this, are also in the Community of Christ library, where you can see she's interviewed by Joseph Smith III a couple days before her death, where he wrote down the questions and then asked her that. So Emma, Martin, and David favor this seer stone that we still have today. Other witnesses of the Book of Mormon, this is particularly Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, talk about the Nephite interpreters, which this is just a facsimile of. Joseph Smith's mother, for instance, notes that after Joseph receives the plates at the Hill Cumorah, he doesn't bring them home. He hides them in the woods. And she, according to her history, went up to him and said, I don't know how you're not going crazy all the time, not knowing where those plates are. This is what she said happened. She said, Joseph returned home from receiving the plates, and he said to his mother, do not be uneasy. All is right. I've got a key. And I knew not what he meant, she writes, but took the article in my hands and, examining it with no covering but a silk handkerchief, found that it consisted of 2 smooth 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows, connected with each other in the same way that old-fashioned spectacles are made. So she's talking about the Nephite interpreters, it sounds like, here as well. And when it comes down to the question of did they use the Nephite interpreters or did they use the seer stone that we've been talking about, best answer we can come up with is yes, they probably used both when they translated the Book of Mormon. It's compatible to basically say that they used both of them. There's also strong evidence that Joseph Smith had at least one other seer stone that was in his possession as late as 1843. A revelation he receives in 1843, one of the people that was there, William Clayton, recalled Hiram Smith saying, why don't you write this through the Urim and Thummim? That indicates that Joseph Smith had some sort of Urim and Thummim, and that he may have used the term Urim and Thummim to describe all these instruments, though by the 1840s, it seems like most of the time he was talking about the Nephite interpreters. So it is kind of neat to think that we have one of the instruments that may have been used in Book of Mormon translation Even if it doesn't fit our cultural context anymore, it's there. And in looking at all these witnesses, one of the things I urge my students to do is to back up a little bit and don't miss the forest for the trees. In my faith tradition, we favor the Nephite interpreters because we trusted Joseph and Oliver the most. We didn't trust David Whitmer or Emma Smith or Martin Harris because they went off and were associated with different movements. But in the last couple of years, we've circled back to saying, hey, David and Emma and Martin were all saying that the Book of Mormon was miraculous. So why are we distrusting them? And so the major message from all of them is that something incredible happened that they just couldn't account for, that Joseph Smith should not have been able to produce the text of the Book of Mormon, but using these instruments, he did. So material history can help us understand that a little bit and know where that's coming from. Now, from translation to publication, this is a copy of the Book of Mormon owned by Joseph Smith Jr. This one even has a place where Joseph Smith notices himself in 2nd Nephi. I'm not sure if this is authentic or not because it doesn't really look like his handwriting, but there is a mark here where it says Joseph Smith, the subject of prophecy, and it's noting 2nd Nephi 3 that talks about Joseph. This is a book owned by Samuel Harrison Smith, who most of you will note is the very first missionary of the church. I don't know if this is authentic too, but you can see on the back page, because the witnesses are in the back of the book rather than the front like they are now, where the 8 witnesses are, and Samuel's the last one, and there's little stars next to his name. Whether he put those stars there himself or they were added by a later descendant, we're not really sure. But we do have at least one story where we always talk about how Samuel's the first missionary and he goes out and doesn't convert anybody. In fact, the only person he's able to even hand a book off to, and he's trying to sell the books, is a guy named John Green. Now, Samuel, though, does his due diligence and he follows up with John Green and meets with John's wife, Rhoda Green. Rhoda Green one day asks Samuel to pray for her and then breaks down in tears, and Samuel prays together, and she eventually becomes a convert to the Book of Mormon. She gets her brother, Phineas, to also listen to him, and apparently at a conversation where Rhoda and Phineas and Samuel were all there, Phineas turned to the last page of the Book of Mormon and said to Samuel, "Is not this your name in the book?" And Samuel apparently turned to him and said, "Yes, and I can testify that I've seen the plates and I know the record to be true." And that's a big deal to people in my faith tradition because Rhoda's maiden name was Young. Her brother was Phineas Young. And he takes the book home to his brother, Brigham Young, who's eventually converted to the gospel and becomes kind of important to us. Got a couple other interesting copies of the Book of Mormon, too. For instance, this is an 1830 copy owned by Hiram Smith. You'll note here a couple notes in the front where the person that he handed this to, which was Reynolds Cahoon, noted this is Hiram Smith's book. You can see Reynolds Cahoon's name right down here at the bottom. This book, surprisingly, was passed from a Latter-day Saint family to an African-American family. And they used it as their family Bible, even though they weren't members of any kind of restoration tradition, until there was only one member of the family left, who contacted a collector here in Utah and eventually gave him the book. But contained in the book and what came along with it were family photos going back to the 1860s of this African-American family that participated in the grand tradition of the Book of Mormon. Now, from translation to publication to conceptual doctrines that are in there, and one that's a connecting point for a lot of different restoration movements is the City of Zion. So this is a map of the City of Zion that you might be familiar with. You can find it on the Joseph Smith Papers site, and it overlays a place we're probably all familiar with too, which is the Independence Temple lot. Most of you have probably been there, and most of you probably know that this portion of the temple lot and this portion of the temple lot are owned by Community of Christ. This is owned by the Hedrickite Church, which is also affectionately known as the Church of the Temple Lot. And this part of the temple lot is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And if you interpose this over the top of this particular map of Zion, a couple interesting things happen. And this is the whole thing. And this is what the paper looks like. This is on display in the Church History Museum in Salt Lake. You'll note the square nature of the city. The city was supposed to be 1 mile square with straight streets. There's a lot of cities out here in Utah that actually follow this design and have this kind of grid system set up, including Salt Lake City. At the center was the temple lot right here. This lot was for bishop storehouses. And on the temple lot, there's numbers 1 to 24 because there were supposed to be 24 temples at the center of the city. A later map, the first one I showed you was from June 1833. This one's from August of 1833, is even bigger and clearly shows the temples at the first. It's also moved the bishop storehouses out to the periphery of the city instead of the center. There's one more that we don't know exactly when it comes from, but this one also shows the temples at the center. And we also have other documents that show what the temples would have looked like. Temples looked very similar to what the Kirtland Temple ended up being. They were a little bit more short and a little bit wider, but on the interior, there was congregational space with pulpits at both ends, just like they eventually built in the Kirtland Temple. And here's a good view of what the temples would have looked like. All that writing that you saw on the plat of the city of Zion illustrated the purposes of the temples. There were going to be temples dedicated to the bishopric of the church, the presiding bishopric, high priests, teachers, deacons, elders, and probably the presidency, which we think is an early reference to the first presidency, which had just barely been set aside in 1833. You'll note there's no temple for the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. They hadn't been called yet. And it's possible that if and when the city gets built, there'll be other temples that take into account other church organizations. But a couple people like John Hamer have noted, if you look at the designs, and this is the June design, and this is the August design, and interpose them over the existing City of Independence, you see some interesting things. For instance, the June design, if it had been built, here's the existing City of Independence, here's the June design, would have taken up about half the city. And the August design, if it had been followed out, would have completely subsumed the entire City of Independence. So these maps may have been a little inflammatory. They might be the reason why today the temple lot is still kind of in a divided state, because the Latter-day Saints themselves were kind of, I guess, maybe too open about their ambitions, which was to build the city of Zion. And that could have been something that put out a couple people from these independent settlements here. Just to interpose the map today a little bit, the first temple, the first of the 24, is the one that's on the temple lot that's owned by the Hendrickite Church. This is interposed what it would have looked like. The Hendrickites themselves have a couple sacred relics linked to these, like you've probably seen these cornerstones that they have in their building. Every once in a while, they'll go out and form the footings of the temple. And today, there's two temples close nearby, one operated by Community of Christ, one about 15 minutes up the road, operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in both traditions, there's a number of folkloric things linked to these buildings. That's kind of fun as we go. Now, talking about the temple that they did get built in the 1830s, though, this is Kirtland Temple stucco. And I love the Kirtland Temple. I know many of you do. Regardless of what restoration movement you're in, this is a sacred, special building. And some of the stories associated with the Kirtland Temple and the sacrifices they made are really beautiful and compelling. Now, a couple things, and some of this you might be familiar with. We're used to seeing the Kirtland Temple, its interior and exterior being emphasizing white. The original temple, based on the descriptions we have, was not white, it was blue. In fact, here's a painting made in the 1880s that might give you a feel for what the color of the temple was. Another story that really popped up in my church was that the saints had taken their best china and their glass and ground it up to place it in the mortar of the Kirtland Temple so that the temple would sparkle. And there's some people talking about it sparkling. And here's the original mortar. This is a piece that is owned by the Utah Church. This is a piece that's actually from the visitor center in Kirtland that a friend of mine let me look at. And here's another piece that's at the Kirtland Visitor Center. One of the things we found was that the story that they ground up their finest china is not true. But they did have china and glass in the mortar. We found an early story that said that Artemis Millet, the foreman of the construction of the Kirtland Temple, sent men and boys to different towns and places to gather old crockery and glass to put in the cement. And so I don't know if that means they were too poor to have fine china and glass. Not all of them were, but they did the efficient thing, which was they found it in the local dumps of other communities and ground it up and turned it into that special sanctified building. The original martyr was taken off in the 1950s. It had started to deteriorate a little bit and was replaced by the current mortar, which you can now see in the Kirtland Temple. But there's still a lot of personality to this building, like the cracks that you see in the facade that are just part of how the building was built and constructed and part of what makes it beautiful. Now, from the translation of the Book of Mormon to the last witnesses of the Book of Mormon and some of the things that caused it to be so special, I'm putting this up because I think it was Trevor that asked about this. This is John Taylor's pocket watch. And a number of the artifacts that we found were taken and associated with Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's martyrdom when Joseph Smith was killed. We found a ton of people, more than there's probably possible, that had what are called martyrdom canes that were made from the casket that Joseph and Hiram were placed in. But even these have a complicated history. For instance, I was talking about this with a couple people present, but they took a pocket watch similar to John Taylor's pocket watch, and they did a kind of Mythbusters thing where they fired a caliber bullet similar to what the mob would have been using. Mob were using these standard militia-issued rifles, and the watch didn't deflect the bullet. In fact, the watch blew up completely. And when they examined this watch, the damage to it wasn't consistent with something that had been hit by a bullet. So we've got to go back to the drawing board and maybe put together the pictures. By the way, there's other objects associated here that are controversial too, like the pistol Joseph Smith used. These are the clothes that Hiram Smith was wearing. Hiram Smith's family hung on to these clothes until 2015, when they donated them to the church, and they're now on display in the church history library. And all these objects kind of help us put together the last moments. So they're in Carthage jail. Every account mentions that they read from the Book of Mormon on the day that this happened. There were people in and out the entire 3 days they were in Carthage, but the most consistent people there were Joseph and Hiram and Willard Richards and John Taylor. Willard and John are the only members of the Quorum of the 12 that were still in Nauvoo when this happened. Everybody else was out on a mission for Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. Talk about a mob surrounding the jail. And as the mob approached the jail, they started to fire into the windows. There's plenty of room to get a ball in the window, and they send a group in to directly force the door open and fire at them. So most of you have probably been to Carthage jail. If you live in the Midwest, this is kind of a must-see if you're from the Latter-day Saint tradition. Bullets coming in the window, so they move away from the windows. They move over towards the door, but a group of men are coming up the stairs. These stairs, I took a picture of one of the missionaries walking up the stairs, are real narrow. You can't fit more than maybe one person on the stairs. There could have been a group going up to the landing in front of the door. Landing in front of the door is also narrow, so it's feasible that 4 men holding the door shut could keep it shut even if the mob's trying to get in. But after a few moments of them holding the door, the mob changes tactics. They back up and they fire into the door, which you can see right here still has a panel. And by the way, this panel has its own history that takes it in and out of Carthage jail. It's another fascinating object. There was so much stuff linked to the martyrdom. We just had to pick 3 or 4 items and go with it. This bullet hole apparently is the one that hits Hiram Smith in the face. Hiram's death mask has a little distortion here because they had to plug the bullet hole with cotton and kills him. And at that point, John Taylor runs to the window. Now, looking at the watch and going back and looking at what John Taylor actually wrote, John Taylor says he ran to the window in maybe a frantic attempt to perhaps leap from the window. They're so desperate, he's thinking maybe he'll try and escape. But the way he tells it is on his way to the window, he was hit by a shot that caused an involuntary reaction that caused him to pitch forward. And he thought he was going to fall out the window, but something pushed him in. Now, later on, in fact, the way he notes it, it's several days after the martyrdom, because he gets wounded so badly he has to go to the doctor. They bring him his watch and it's in an envelope. And he said that he opened the envelope and poured the contents out, and that the glass face of the watch had been completely pulverized. I think the phrase he uses was it had been turned to sand. And then he pulls it out and he looks at the watch and he makes the assumption that a bullet must have hit the watch. Now, the damage to the watch is not consistent with a bullet. It's consistent with some sort of blunt force impact. So what we think may have happened was that when John was shot, he fell forward and hit into the edge of the window so hard that he shattered the watch. And that's consistent because the watch itself is really only about this big, if you can see it in person. The little distortion that you see right here isn't a bullet hole. That's not any bigger than a BB is. It's the gears of the watch which have been driven forward through the face of the watch as if someone hit it really, really hard. And so I think John Taylor was telling the truth. I think he thought that was what happened, and everything happened so fast. According to him and Willard Richards, it's 2 minutes from the time the whole thing occurs. But it doesn't seem like what he thought happened actually happened. The material kind of tells us a little bit more about the story. Now, another interesting aspect is that for a long time, John Taylor also told the story that after Hiram was killed, Joseph picked up a pepper box pistol, walked over and fired the pepper box pistol blindly around the door. For years and years, in fact, decades until 2015, this was the pepper box pistol that was on display, and it's a big weapon. In 2015, when they redid the church history library, they took apart this pepper box pistol, and they found out that the firing mechanism in it had been patented in 1845. So it probably wasn't the pistol. In fact, there were 3 pistols that claimed to be the pepper box pistol, and now the pistol on display is this one, which is much smaller, fires about a 32 caliber bullet. Here's photos of the pistols side by side. There's a single shot pistol that Hiram Smith also held on while he was in there. That means that what Joseph fired back at the mob wasn't as big as we thought it was initially. We don't know if he hit anybody. Both John and Willard say that the gun misfired and only 3 bullets were discharged. But that might mean that the weapon, which again, this whole story fits a little bit better if it's smaller, because it was smuggled into the jail in Cyrus Willox's pantaloon pocket, was probably smaller than we think it was. When you see it in person, the actual gun's about this big. It doesn't fire a big bullet. It would have made a lot of smoke and a lot of noise, but I don't know if it would have hurt or killed anybody. And again, we don't have reliable sources saying that it did or not. So all these relics together are just the sort of thing that we can use as we kind of do detective work to put these pieces together. It enlivens the story. It deepens our discourse on it. Sometimes it confirms that a person can be completely telling the truth, but be mistaken, even in events like Carthage jail. And sometimes it confirms that things are more complicated than we initially see them to be. Like I said, with my students, when it comes back to things like the seer stone, I usually sit down with them and say, hey, some say the seer stone, some say the Nephite interpreters, it's probably both, but don't miss the forest for the trees. Everybody that participated in this, whether they talked about a seer stone or whether they talked about Nephite interpreters, felt that they had seen and witnessed something miraculous. And that's the real point of the story, is that it can get a little bit more complicated based on who we're talking to, but every one of them felt like something incredible had happened, and it helped them know and see that the Book of Mormon was something special, and that the movement that they were joining, they felt was something that came from God, and that gave them faith that helped and sustained them through all the trials and difficulties that they faced. So that's kind of the end, unless you want to keep going. I'm more than happy to answer your questions as we go. Any questions that you have? James, please go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Most of the folks in this group were probably expecting me to make a comment here. I'm not going to belabor my point, but I do need to ask, are you familiar with our book, By Means of the Urim and Thummim, Restoring Translation to the Restoration? Have you seen the book?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as you know, in this book, we walk through the seerstone narrative and the witnesses who are cited to favor the seerstone narrative, and demonstrate that taken in the broader context, they're not as reliable as this sort of historical consensus has made them recently. And that we feel that, as you correctly point out, it was Joseph and Hiram were the primary witnesses, and they were clear that the instrument of translation was the Jaredite Nephite interpreters, which had come to with the gold plates. So if you're familiar with the book, I won't, interrogate you on details, because I'd like to, we'd like to have other folks have a chance to raise questions here, because this, presentation has been very interesting on all sorts of different issues. But I would, maybe ask this question, which is, again, this is kind of I'm assuming the argument in our book, which is that taken in the broader historical context and examined closely, the Searstone witnesses, are not nearly as strong or reliable as the current historical consensus has taken them. But, even yourself, you've noted that, the two primary witnesses, Joseph and Oliver, did only speak of the Jaredite Nephite interpreters. So I guess I have just a general question for you, since you're there at BYU and a part of the historical community. Why do you folks downplay Joseph and Oliver's testimony in favor of testimony from people like David Whitmer, who's never a witness to the translation process, Martin Harris, who had only on one occasion was there a secondhand account published after his death, where he mentioned the Searstone, whereas there are dozens of accounts where he mentioned the interpreters as being the method of translation. And you cite extensively from the last testimony of Sister Emma, which is, a very questionable document. So I'm curious to get your reaction to why the historical community has prioritized these very unreliable and questionable, problematic accounts over the very clear and definitive accounts from Joseph and Oliver that it was the Jaredite Nephite interpreters that were used to translate the Book of Mormon.
Well, you could probably tell from my presentation that I lean your direction quite a bit.
Okay.
I agree with you that Joseph and Oliver, who are the two people we most want to talk to when it comes to Book of Mormon translation, just clearly talk about the Nephite interpreters over and over and over again. At the same time, I don't want to throw out those references to the Searstone too, and I think there's a way to reconcile them. Now, I also agree with you that some scholars have maybe overplayed the Searstone as a reliable instrument of translation. At the same time, too, I'm open to the idea that the Searstone may have played some sort of role. Like I said, it's got a provenance that goes back to Joseph Smith. I don't want to throw out Emma or David Whitmer or Martin Harris. I think that they're all important. And I'm seeking to find a way to reconcile. Like I said, I teach the controversy to my students and then basically point out that, hey, the big picture here is that everybody thought something miraculous was going on. But yeah, I lean your direction when it comes to how Book of Mormon translation happened. It seems like Joseph and Oliver are both clear that it's the Nephite interpreters. And I've had colleagues try to suggest some way to reconcile. I had one colleague who said maybe Joseph was more protective about the Nephite interpreters. And so when someone like David Whitmer or Martin Harris was present, he used the Searstone as a way of sort of demonstrating divine power, but keeping the instruments of translation that were primarily used away from them. Does that make sense?
Because he had been commanded to not show them to other people. Without specific permission.
Yeah, one analogy one of my colleagues used was, I can't show you a $100 bill, so I'll show you a $20 bill or something like that. I think that works. We've even found a source when Joseph Smith was taking the manuscript around to be published, that he goes to this publisher in Rochester, and according to the publisher's reminiscence, he takes out some instrument and starts translating, showing him how the text was received. I don't think he would have done that with the Nephite interpreters, but I could see him maybe doing that with the seer stone. And so I'm comfortable saying that both might have divine power, but I agree with you that it seems like the Nephite interpreters to Joseph and Oliver were the main story and the main instrument used. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand. And I mean, one of our proposals, of course, is that the Joseph used the seer stone to demonstrate how the process worked to his followers, who, of course, were extremely curious about it. And so that was the source of a lot of the seer stone accounts, along with the possibility that he took one of the Urim and Thummim seer stones, not seer stones, one of the Urim and Thummim, authentic Urim and Thummim stones, when he was not doing translation, but just using it to receive revelation. He could have taken that authentic Urim and Thummim seer stone out, put it in a hat so nobody could see it, because he'd been commanded to keep it secret, when he was receiving other kinds of revelations. Like there are several sections in the Doctrine and Covenants that are indicated that they were received through the Urim and Thummim. So anyway, we propose those alternatives, and I would point out that we may have some common ground in that, at least there are some folks who just simply dismiss Emma and David and even Martin as being, simply apostates and who could believe anything that they had to say. But we tried to take a much more, subtle or understanding approach, recognizing that they all were sincere Book of Mormon believers, and they were trying to defend the Book of Mormon, although they kind of exaggerated their seer stone experiences in the service of as they saw it, of the Book of Mormon. But anyway, I see other people with comments here, so I won't belabor the point. As long as you are acquainted with our book, I'll leave the most of it to that.
I'm acquainted with your book, and I appreciate the good work that you've done. I really do. All right, Trevor,
Okay.
I think you were the second one to raise your hand here.
All right. So for those that don't know, I've never been part of the Latter-day Saint movement, but I unfortunately didn't get to see all of your presentations. Sorry about that. I'll go look at back of it. But I was talking with a friend who is a critic of the Latter-day Saint movement, and he was telling me concerning the Carthage gun, that he saw that the Carthage gun, like you said, it was the 1845, and he emailed somebody, and like a week later that they changed it to a different gun. What are your thoughts about critics being able to help out the Latter-day Saint movement if my friend that is a critic was right about the gun?
I mean, we're open to interpretation and ideas, right? There's actually 3 pistols that trace themselves back to Carthage jail. The one that was on display, they thought had the best provenance because it came through John Taylor. But like I said, in 2015, they dismantled the Church History Museum. They refreshed their exhibits, and that gave them a chance to take the actual pistol that had been on display out. That's when they found that the firing mechanism wasn't contemporary with Joseph Smith. So they substituted in one of the other pistols. And that one, I think, fits the narrative a little bit better, that it was something that was small enough that it could be brought into the jail without the guards noticing. I think the other gun, which I've also seen, it was fairly large, probably isn't the one. Well, it's definitely not the one because of the firing mechanism. And so, I mean, critics are welcome to say what they say, and we're trying to get the story right. I think that it was helpful in this particular case that somebody may have pointed out some inconsistencies, because if there's something that's inconsistent, then we want to try and get it correct. At the same time, there's a lot of emotion surrounding this. I know a descendant of John Taylor who's genuinely upset over the scholarship that's been published about the watch, because his grandfather told the story, and the way he told it was that the bullet hit the watch. I think his grandpa's telling the truth. I really do. I think that's what John Taylor thought genuinely happened. And it's still miraculous that he survived in any circumstance, because, I mean, Carthage jail was Carthage jail. I mean, the fact that anybody walked out of there alive is remarkable and miraculous in my view as well. So I think there's a way to reconcile and use the tools of reason and observation alongside these narratives that build people's faith in a way that's helpful. And sometimes critics have been genuinely helpful and pushed us to deepen our search and our ideas and our scholarship as well. So I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, I just remember he said he saw that the gun was wrong, and then he sent if I remember correctly, he sent an email, and then a week or two later that they did switch the guns. And I find that interesting that a critic would maybe have his history more correct than the actual LDS church, if my friend is telling the truth, which I believe he is.
Well, I mean, I was there when they refreshed the museum. It took about a year. And so it wasn't one person said something and then they swapped it out the next week. They redid and kind of revamped the entire museum. It was very much a process that took a long time. And the museum was closed for over a year. So I would just doubt the part of the story that a letter was written and the next day the guns were swapped out. No, I don't know your friend. No offense to him.
I'll check in with my friend to see what his story was.
Okay. Paul, you had a question?
Well, yes, of course I have questions, a whole series of them, but I'm going to try to limit myself. I wanted to first of all say thank you for the presentation. It's delightful to have somebody else interested in artifacts and able to help show some of the nuances of how they can help us to better address history. I'm curious, the picture you have in front of us of a watch and chain is something you haven't talked about. And so I'm interested in why we're getting that picture.
Yeah, two things that we ran into a lot when we were putting together a book were watches and Bibles. And this was one of the prettiest pictures that we had. This is a watch that belonged to Eliza R. Snow. And we really wanted to include her, but in any book on restoration artifacts, John Taylor's watch is probably the most famous one, though there are a number of famous ones, and there's a lot of famous Bibles too. We had one person who believes he has the Smith family Bible that has the notes of all of Joseph and Emma's children written in it, but we had to choose between that and the Bible that was used for the Bible translation project the Community of Christ has. So it was really difficult, but just for the sake of variety, we researched everything. We went with the ones that we felt were most reliable. For instance, that Bible that had all the Smith children's names written in it was a little questionable. The handwriting, which the owner claimed was Emma Smith, when we handed it to an expert and he looked at it, said that it didn't quite look like her. And so knowing that one Bible was authentic and this one looked like it was authentic, but we couldn't prove it for sure, we went with the one we thought was more authentic. But it's kind of tricky. A lot of stuff that people, dearly hold on to as family heirlooms, when we started investigating, we found out weren't as authentic as they thought they were. So someone handed us a chair that they said Brigham Young had made for one of his wives and measured it specifically for her. We took pictures of it and then took it to an expert, and the expert said, "Oh yeah, that's factory made. I can show you where dozens of those were made." And so it was tough to go back and say, "I'm sorry, we can't put this in our book," but we were trying to, do our best to make sure that everything was correct as we did it too. Sorry, Paul.
I'd like to recommend that we open or close the screen share so that we see the people and keep, that'll facilitate for Deb to be able to keep track of the hands that are waving and those that have actually found their way down to the reactions to raise their hands.
Okay.
And I haven't seen anybody with their hands down now that we've got that open. So let me encourage you, if you'd like to get a question or comment in, go to the reactions, raise your hand, and let Deb try to keep us in order. Oh, and in the meantime, since I've got the voice working anyway, then take us back to the Kirtland Temple. You mentioned about the cracks in the temple, but I didn't get an explanation for understanding them.
Well, underneath the and you could maybe see that in one of the photos, but when you take off the the stucco that was on the temple originally. You don't see these smooth cut stones like you do on later temples, like the one in Nauvoo. It's rubble stone construction. And that's apparently Artemis Millet too, who came to Joseph and said the best way to build this is to just grab these stones, and I know a way of cementing them together. They covered that up by putting the stucco over top of it. In fact, early photos show that the Kirtland Temple had kind of a stencil over top of it that was supposed to make it look like brick, but it was meant to cover up the rubble stone. And the rubble stone's been a little troublesome with the Kirtland Temple when it comes to creating seismic stability, because that's not the hardiest material, though they've done quite a bit, as I understand it, to shore up the building and make sure that it is safe. But it's still a little bit delicate, and that just endears the Kirtland Temple to me. It's a labor of love built by people who didn't have the resources and the know-how, but had the faith to do what they did.
My understanding is that with the highway going directly by the front and heavy trucks traveling there, that the cracks could be attributed to that heavy truck traffic. And
Yeah,
so
that rattling that's there.
and they did, yeah, they then had to do rerouting in order to get the heavy truck traffic away from that building to minimize the fracturing.
Yeah, that might be the case. I'm not sure.
Okay. Paul, were you done?
Well, I'd certainly yield to anybody else, but I don't see any other hands.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of hands up.
Okay, well,
We've got 5 so far.
all right, go
Okay.
for it.
Val, go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question about the pistols again. You say there were 3 different pistols.
Mhm.
I ask because our family tradition is that my great-great-grandfather, John Solomon Fulmer, was the owner of one of those pistols. And I'm wondering if you know what the provenance of the pistols that were there.
I don't recall. I did that research a couple of years ago, but I do have the article that traces the provenance of the 3 pistols. I'd be happy to shoot that to you. In fact, why don't I put my
Yeah, if you could put that in the chat.
my email in the chat, and anybody that wants to can email me, and I'll be happy to share some of that research with you. Again, it's not my research, but I can point you in the direction of the person that wrote it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think it's Monty that's next.
Murphy next, and then James. Go ahead, Monty.
I'm busy unmuting myself here. I've always felt that whether it was the Urim and Thummim or the stone in the hat, I know that they claim that he used either one or both of these things, but I'm pretty sure he used the same old God when the translating.
Yeah,
And
I
that
agree.
was the important part to me.
I agree. And honestly, I put David Whitmer's quote up there, but one dispute I'd have with David Whitmer would be that what he's describing there with Joseph just kind of reading the text off doesn't match what's in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah.
Where Oliver Cowdery is told you have to study it out and ask if it's right, all that stuff. And sometimes I think we're so anxious to look at these new documents that we're not familiar with that we kind of neglect the older ones. I show David Whitmer's stuff to my students, and then I usually go to the Doctrine and Covenants and say, and here's something that's even older than David Whitmer's writings that seems to indicate it's more than just I'll show you the words, you read off the words. Now, like I said, there are a lot of people that like what David Whitmer has to say because it favors a tight translation. But I think the whole picture, especially when you take into account Joseph and Oliver Cowdery, paints a slightly different picture that has a little bit more volition on their part.
Well, I think every time I tell a story, people ask me, is that true? And I say yes, and I make it truer every time.
Yep, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. That was my dad's motto. Let's see, James, you were next.
Okay, now I'm talking. Just to prove that I'm interested in subjects other than the translation. I was curious. I recently, and I'm now forgetting completely who it was, but I believe one of your colleagues was on a podcast talking about the city of Zion and referred to Doctrine and Covenants section 124, verse 49, in the LDS Doctrine and Covenants, where it says that if the saints were blocked from building Zion in Jackson County, that the work was no longer required at their hands. And at least that person's interpretation of that was that basically, while obviously the temple lot in Jackson County is of enormous historical interest, that it was basically that commandment was no longer operative. I mean, the command to build the temples there and to build the city of Zion there is no longer operative, and therefore that it's only of historical interest, and it has no immediate religious. It no longer has any religious significance. And I may be misquoting the person because I can't even remember who it was, but it was someone some seemed like some knowledge. So I was just wondering what, since you had a nice, very interesting discussion of the city of Zion, the Plat of Zion artifacts, if you had any views on whether, in fact, those temples that you showed in your wonderful 3D diagram there actually will someday be built there, or if we should be concerned or interested in or working toward or striving toward a day when that particular plat will in fact be built out the way Joseph revealed it in, what was it, 1833. So it's interested in your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think I know the colleague you're talking about. His name's Scott Woodward.
Yes,
and he and I
that's who it was.
he and I do a podcast together, and I love Scott, and he's one of my dear friends. I completely disagree with him on this point.
Oh, okay.
Because, he uses Section 124 to try and say they were released from building the temple and the city all together. That means that independence isn't a big deal anymore. And I use Section 101, where the Lord says, Zion shall not be moved out of her place, notwithstanding her children are scattered. So Scott uses Section 124 to basically say the command to build Zion and independence is no longer in effect. And I'm using it to say the Lord was saying, yeah, not now, but we will eventually do this. To me, that's the best way to reconcile those two revelations. But he and I have had intense discussions about that. And I'm fine if the Lord gives a definitive revelation where he says it doesn't have to be an independence. And I'm going to reveal my own bias here. As someone that works among the different movements, I want everybody to come together. And I sort of think, and this is just my editorial opinion, that we need to build it there because it's important that we build it upon the principles of righteousness, like the Fishing River Revelation says, and that we bring together all these groups and create harmony amongst them. I mean, that's why I do some of my interfaith work. I want to build Zion, right? And I'm grateful that independence hasn't turned into the Temple Mount in Jerusalem so far. But I do think that the Lord gave us a couple obstacles because we got to learn a couple things on the way. So Scott and I have had intense discussions back and forth, and I just think he's wrong, to be honest with you. But I do respect him a lot, and I'm not saying anything here that I wouldn't say to his face or haven't said to him when he's in the room. And that might be my experience in independence, my love for the people of the different movements speaking here. Maybe I'm biased, but I also think that if I took my biases away, I got to fit those two scriptures together. I got to harmonize them. And the best way to do that is to say that Section 124 wasn't a not ever, it was just a not now. You're not responsible to do this right now, but eventually we will be asked to do it.
Okay, well, I certainly can see the point that, I mean, independence is truly a common ground for all the restoration movements. So I can respect that argument. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification. Very, very enlightening.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
MRSQ3, go ahead.
Mike Riggs.
Hey, I'm sorry, a little bit late, and I also wanted to mention that last week I was deployed in Vermont with FEMA, and I had to. I was still at a business meeting at that night and that Monday night, and had to get up at 2:30 in the morning to fly back to Baltimore. So I knew that Paul could handle it. Anyway, since today is September 11th, if the question about the redemption of Zion, Ron Romig and I published a chapter in an anthology, the Missouri Mormon Experience, with the University of Missouri Press, and we talked about Joseph Smith's saying that the Zion would be redeemed by September 11th, 1836, which also became a non-confirmed prophecy of his. So if you're interested in that conversation about redemption of Zion, we kind of also come to a conclusion that Joseph's definition of locality and place evolved over time and as well. So anybody interested, you could go look at that as well. And with that, good luck with the conference, Casey. And later this month. And again, I'm going to probably be deployed with FEMA. I was going to plan to be there with Paul because we're kicking off our book on Hans Mill. In fact, it came out today. Paul Pryor mentioned this. And it's now on Amazon on Hans Mill, our archaeology work that we did there. So with that, I will sign off. I got to be somebody tomorrow, but thank you very much, and good to see y'all. Take care.
Thanks for all you're doing. It feels like a busy time to work with FEMA. So,
well, this, who knew that they were going to, schedule John Whitmer meetings in the middle of hurricane season?
We should have planned better, huh?
That was really poor planning 50 years ago. Anyway, but good luck. I'm sure you'll do a great job, and congratulations on being president.
Oh, thank you.
Good night. Please remember 22 years ago today.
Como?
Okay. Thank you, David.
I think David was just mentioning that 9/11 was 22 years ago today.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay.
and let me mention that Mike
Pray
Riggs.
for the victims of the Morocco earthquake as well.
Let me mention that Mike Riggs was president of John Whitmer some 20 years ago. And I'm not sure exactly how many, but I think he was president during the 30th anniversary, where Casey came in at the end of the 50th.
Yeah.
Well, that's a nice connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, go ahead, and then Wednesday.
Thank you. I have three things I'm interested in mentioning. Back in the 70s, I spent a summer, most of the time at Kirtland, as a guide, as a volunteer at the temple. And at that time, I had the chance to travel one day about 3 miles south to where the quarry was, where the stones for the temple were split by methods that they were using about that era of time. If you haven't seen that, that would be an interesting thing to see. I also was investigating the question of, is the Book of Mormon real? Is Joseph Smith real? And I ran into a site on in Salt Lake City that had various references, and one of them I picked up was testimony from a person who was not a member of the church, but was a neighbor, and said essentially he saw the covered plates and hefted them, and he knew that Joseph Smith was not rich enough to even own that much lead, so it must have been gold, as claimed. And finally, also at that time, I was reading about the uses of seer stones, and it appears that seer stones, as you had hinted there, had other uses, Casey, that various people were using, and there was some evidence that Joseph Smith himself was either using seer stones or something similar to be doing things such as hunting for water well sites and things like this. I think there was more there. I think that was much more commonly a method people were trying to use to solve their problems in a community. That's it.
Well, thank you for those comments. And that is one of the things that we're finding with Joseph Smith. I recommend Mike McKay and Nick Frederick's book, where they kind of try and place this tradition of seer stones in the larger tradition of what was going on in the culture region Joseph Smith lived in. And one of my favorite things is everybody knows the story where Joseph Smith goes to get the plates, and he's attacked 3 times on his way back. And I always wondered when I heard that story as a kid, how did they know where he was all 3 times? And then I read Lucy Mack Smith's history, and she says that the people that were trying to find Joseph had hired a guy with a seer stone to tell them where he was at, and that apparently his information was accurate. So you've got seer stones on one side and seer stones on another side, and it just kind of shows how enmeshed in their culture that was. Once I started to look at that, I started to look at how important seer stones appeared to be to the Whitmer family. That to them, it wasn't abnormal to use a seer stone. It was abnormal to not use one, that they didn't trust Joseph when he wasn't using some kind of instrument. So it's a little interesting cultural overview for the restoration. And thanks for bringing that up. And I'd love to pick your brain about Kirtland sometime. Next year, Mormon MHA is going to be meeting in Kirtland. So I'm hoping I'll be there and give a presentation.
Okay, Wednesday, and then Rick. Go ahead, Wednesday.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation, Casey. It was really great. So my question is there a particular reason that the Kirtland Temple was initially blue?
I can't find any reason in the sources, other than well, I don't know. Yeah. It is the first temple that the church builds, and for some reason, the stereotype in people's mind is a temple is a granite or white building, but it doesn't seem like to the early saints that was a consideration. In fact, the sources indicate that the temple was blue, that the doors were bright green, and that there was red highlights found throughout, which it must have been quite a sight to see. And most people, whether they were pro or anti the church during that time, did talk about how the temple was a pretty impressive looking building, especially for a frontier community like Kirtland that didn't have a lot of know-how or resources. So I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah, I was wondering, so like in my culture, color does have a significance. So I'm Galagichi. Blue is the color of protection. And so a lot of buildings will be painted a specific, like haint blue. So I was wondering if there was some lore on another culture's view, a shade for a religious building.
Oh, you've given me an avenue of research that I need to find out what the significance of blue would have been back at that point in time. I'm really interested now. I'd love to research that. So thank you.
No problem. Right, thanks.
Let me encourage you to add into that, Casey.
I talk about the great granite building in Salt Lake City, Utah. The great granite building, the temple. Oh, I refer to the great granite building in Salt Lake City, Utah, the temple on the mountain at Salt Lake.
No, they're referring to the Kirtland Temple, I believe.
Yeah, we're talking about the Kirtland.
In Ohio.
I wanted to add, Casey, that the parallels drawn from the Quakers are significant on that Kirtland Temple in terms of the architectural design. Within 30 miles or so, there are a couple of other Quaker buildings that are very similar that I think might very well be instructive, and so you might look for the blue there as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good lead as well. Appreciate it.
Okay, Rick, I think you're next.
Okay, I'm outside of the concert, so hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm trying to do 3 things at the same time. Casey, I loved your presentation on the Mythbusters bullet, but I think you missed the presentation at MHA where they had some forensics experts, firearms experts from Weber State that actually supported John Taylor's story. That
was that right?
Shot, it had to be at a certain angle. And so did you hear that? I don't think you were in MHA in June, were you?
I wasn't. No, I had responsibilities back in Utah. My paper was read. I'd be interested to read that. You got me in trouble, Rick, because I went on your podcast and I think I named the caliber bullet, and a guy named Sam Weston, who I don't know if he was the researcher or not. He lives up in Logan. He's done tons of work on the martyrdom, contacted me and said it was a 32 caliber bullet, and he had all this information. And he's the one that's done some forensics tests. But I mean, even Sam and most researchers are open to the idea that maybe something happened. It just seems like the most likely explanation was that the watch itself was hit by the windowsill. But again, none of this is set in stone. I'm just presenting research here.
Yeah, for sure. There was a guy, I think his last name is Rimmasch, Rimmasch. He's a Weber State police academy guy, whatever, a forensic expert. And it sounded like they were actually trying to refute the who killed Joseph Smith thing. And so they were like doing angles and this and that. And I didn't actually hear the presentation. I just heard about the presentation. I tried to get Chris on my podcast and he said, well, we're not ready to do that yet. So, but anyway, I guess there's dispute about whether John Taylor is correct or not. So that's all I was trying to say. But
well, I mean, I met up with Sam. Those of you that are listening, you might be familiar with the video that circulated on the internet called Who Murdered Joseph Smith? That sort of puts out this thesis that John Taylor and Willard Richards murdered Joseph Smith. And part of the reason why I connected with Sam Weston was we wanted to do a panel that refuted that too. And boy, Sam really took apart some of that guy's arguments, that it doesn't fit any of the evidence that we know on the scene. I mean, in a lot of ways. So anyway, thanks for your question, Rick. Have fun at the concert, brother.
Okay, Paul, go ahead, please.
As I recall, when I first went to Nauvoo, the story was told of the watch having stopped the bullet at 10 minutes past 5. You showed the watch without hands. What's happened to the hands?
My understanding is that the hands were removed from the watch because they were a little delicate and they didn't want them to break. And so the watch is stored at the Church History Museum, and it is on open display. I mean, you can walk up and see it. It's under thick glass. But I worked with a couple people at the Church History Museum on my book, and my understanding was that even the vibration of people walking up toward the watch, given the delicate state it was in, could have damaged the hand. So they just took them off and put it on display. But you also saw a really early picture of the watch that's from the 19th century, and the hands have been removed by that point too. I wish I could say I knew where the hands are, and they might be at the Church History Museum in Salt Lake, but they also weren't as careful in the 19th century with a lot of objects that we would treat with a lot more delicacy today. So I could call my friends at the library and ask them, but that's my understanding about where they're at.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I might have to intervene here because a couple of you mentioned it's 9/11. It's also my son's 19th birthday. And my wife and daughters are waiting for us to go and drop off some birthday cake to him. And so are there any last minute questions I can answer, and then I might need to excuse myself as well?
Just to thank you for a nice presentation.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Looking forward to meeting you in 3 dimensions in Texas.
Yes, and Paul, I'll probably be in Nauvoo next summer, so I hope I can dig with you again. Me and my daughter were there summer 2022, and we dug with you. So it was a wonderful experience.
That was on the Hiram site?
That was on the Times and Seasons site.
On Times and Seasons, all right.
Yeah, my daughter found some pieces of type. It was a major thrill for her. So she's the one that's waiting outside right now.
Well, there's some real relics that I would hope that we could learn to treasure and find a whole bunch more of.
Oh, I hope so too. And thank you for the good work you're doing there.
Thanks for taking your time on your son's birthday, Casey. That was wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, you guys, and I'd be happy to come back anytime. Just let me know when.
Great. We'll invite you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Well, the rest of you may continue the discussion unless you'd like for me to invite the lady to sing the goodnight song. My guess is that there's a lot of discussion here. And at this stage, we maybe should sing the goodnight song and let the discussion last beyond that. But people who normally have gotten in on the questions haven't yet. And so here's, I certainly want to pause and give you that chance. People like Ron Smith. Hi, Ron. I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks and sure good to have you back. What'd you think tonight?
You're muted, Ron.
Yeah, it's nice to be back. I don't have a particular question, but it was a very interesting presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your coming back. And yes, I just am intrigued at how remarkably diverse our presentations are. And yet at the end of our discussions almost every night, after everybody else has shut off, Ron Edwards will comment about how interesting the discussion was. And so I'm going to invite him to try to do that before we shut the tape off tonight.
Yeah.
Can I take advantage of Ron being on? Just to ask a question. Way back when I think we did one of our original presentations on the translation of the Book of Mormon,
yes,
you had mentioned that your father had written an article for the Saints Herald on the use of the Nephite interpreters.
yes.
And I got, I got confused and had tried to reach out to you to get a copy of that article, and it sort of, the communications just didn't go through. So could I ask you again to send that on to us, or the citation for it or whatever?
Okay, I thought I did get that to you. But yeah, I can send. Now I can't send you the original article that he wrote because it never got published. Okay. But then it was asked to be split into two, and then so he did that, and then they took some of the references out and whatever. But so what I have is the cleaned up version, which also was never published, but I'll be glad to send you. What I have is I made an electronic copy of it, just a HTML, and I can send you that if you don't mind to send email me on it. I'll be glad to send that to you again.
Okay, I have just put my email address in the chat, just directed to you.
Okay.
So if you could shoot me either the document or whatever other information you have on that, I appreciate it very much.
Okay, yeah, I got
Oops.
it. I got it there.
Okay,
All right.
except I put an extra J at the beginning. It's only one J at the beginning.
Only one J. Okay. All right.
All right.
That works.
Okay. Thank you much. Appreciate it.
I'm intrigued this evening in particular because with approaching 500,000 artifacts in the basement of the Red Brick store from all of the years of excavation that we've done, look at the wealth of relics that is available and how much more research needs to be done. And there's just a wealth of opportunity for future generations of students to dig into those relics and learn the lessons that they embody and carry that may very well add specific nuance to our appreciation and understanding of our history. And I'm anxious to keep on digging because I sure like finding more artifacts. It was intriguing this summer to find that big chunk of shirt about the size of my two hands put together, and discovered a big chunk missing out of it. And then we found that flake that was missing and realized that we were looking at a preform. This is a 5,000-year-old mistake. They'd taken too big of a chunk out of the side of it and ruined the whole piece, and so discarded the whole thing. Just amazing to find 5,000-year-olds' mistakes. Just it's interesting that all of us who make mistakes then can gain some empathy with other people who have done so throughout the years. Comments, questions? Open forum. Well, we're past 9:30. Good night. The Lord is watching o'er you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. And thank you all for coming.